Welcome back. Absolutely wrong time to be discussing electrolytes. Right? That too, the non-glamorous ones like calcium, magnesium, phosphate, right? But that's how it is, because the sickest of patients come to you when you are not the most attentive, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. in the morning. That's when the sickest guy will come. That's when your head of the department switches off his mobile. So we should know how we are going to deal with it. 80% of what I'm going to speak is taken from this chapter on electrolyte disturbances, which I have written in the critical care section of the API textbook of medicine, published in January 2019. But don't worry, these are not my opinions which I wrote in this article. It's a summation of several reviews and guidelines. So most of the information I give you is from that article, hence I quoted the reference. So we can begin by looking at the composition of different electrolytes in different parts of the body space. As was spoken in the earlier talk, the extracellular dominance is by the sodium and chloride. Intracellularly, you get potassium, magnesium and phosphate. So that explains most of the problems we face in critical care. Most of the abnormalities of anything that's got to do with potassium, intracellular ions like potassium and phosphate and magnesium will cause irritability of the myocardium. So you get arrhythmias because of this, and neurological abnormalities because of the ones which are predominant in the extracellular matrix. Each electrolyte that is there in the circulation has a role to play. They are not there just to make up the numbers like Ravi Shastri does in our cricket team. Right? So sodium has to maintain the osmotic balance and the fluid balance. Potassium looks at neuromuscular and cardiovascular excitability. Calcium, integrity of the bones, but most importantly in blood clotting. Magnesium is a cofactor in most of the enzymes of metabolism. Chloride again on osmotic pressure. Bicarbonate on acid-base balance. Phosphate energy storage. So each one of these electrolytes has a role to play in our day-to-day activities. So let's look at the first one, potassium. Potassium has got a very narrow range, between which it has to be maintained of 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter, balanced by renal tubular losses and gastrointestinal losses. Whatever you take in the diet is essentially lost in the urine, and a significant amount is lost in the gastrointestinal tract. This is one of the most of these electrolytes, be it potassium or calcium or phosphate. In addition to the feedback loops in the renal tubules and across the gastrointestinal mucosa, also have a hormone-mediated internal regulation, and that applies to potassium as well. And this exists between the extra and intracellular compartments, and the hormones which determine this exchange are insulin, mineralocorticoids and catecholamines. So if you there's a reason why you use insulin for driving the potassium intracellularly when you have hyperkalemia, and you also look at aldosterone for troubleshooting somebody who has got potassium abnormalities. So essentially the potassium intake will activate these plastic sensors and the feed forward regulation is initiated, and you have factors which are in a two-way communication, gut calorific factors. Potassium is called K because way back in our 2nd, 7th class or 6th class we studied that potassium is actually kalium. So the K stands for kalium. So gut calorific factors means the factors which excrete potassium from the gut. So and from the plasma you have a negative feedback regulation, both working on the renal tubules, and you have the circadian rhythm adding to this whole process. Typically, potassium levels are at a peak between 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. That's when most of the hyperkalemias get diagnosed, right? Because of the circadian problem, if you check somebody's potassium mid-afternoon like now, when your insulin levels are very high after a meal, your potassium levels will be actually lower than what you normally have. But if you look at a fasting patient, because of insulinopenia and adrenergic excess, you have higher potassium. So if you are tracking somebody's potassium, somebody is on spironolactone, and you want to track somebody's potassium, or somebody is being initiated on cotrimoxazole for PCP, and you want to track his potassium, it's advisable to check the potassium at the same point of time every day for you to decide on your therapy. A serum potassium level below less than 3.5 millimoles per liter is considered as hypokalemia, but in critically ill patients, manifestations can happen even if the potassium is between 3.5 to 4. That's called relative hypokalemia. So it's recommended that in critically ill patients who are on ventilatory support, who are on vasopressor support, target is to keep the potassium above 4, less than 5 at all points of time. A serum potassium value between 2.5 to 3 millimoles is considered to be moderately severe, and severe hypokalemia is defined as a potassium value of less than 2.5 millimoles per liter. There are several causes of hypokalemia. Increased excretion from the body. As we said, we have both the renal as well as gastrointestinal losses. Non-renal losses can come because of laxative abuse and diarrhea. Renal losses with the use of loop diuretics and osmotic diuretics. If somebody is hypokalemic with hypertension in an intensive care unit, you should be thinking about renovascular hypertension. And if somebody is hypokalemic, renal tubular acidosis and magnesium depletion are the most important factors for an intensivist. Although a nephrologist or a physician would love to make a diagnosis of Bartter syndrome and Gentleman syndrome, we are not very excited about it. We need to look at RTA because some of the drugs which we use, like antifungals, what we described, some of the anti-neoplastic agents, they all produce renal tubular acidosis. So we need to be looking at this entity as the cause of hypokalemia. Sometimes the transcellular shifts because of excessive insulin administration, or asthmatics who are also energy depleted with getting beta adrenergic agonists. You give a huge dose of norepinephrine to somebody, or somebody's got alcohol withdrawal, or a metabolic alkalosis because of hypovolemia itself can cause transcellular shift, which can produce a relative hypokalemia in intensive care unit. So when you have somebody whose potassium is less than 3.5, make sure it is not diurnal, make sure it's not spurious sampling error. If the history is suggestive of transcellular shift, then you treat the cause. We know the causes of transcellular shift, we treat the cause. But if you think it is not a like somebody has not got insulin, there is no beta agonist on board, you have not given norepinephrine, check the urine spot urine potassium, you need to look at it. If the urine spot potassium is less than 20 millimoles per liter, then you are looking at an extra renal loss. But if the spot urine potassium is more than 20, you need to look at the bicarbonate. If the bicarbonate is low, you are looking at metabolic acidosis, or diabetic ketoacidosis, or other causes like acute tubular necrosis and drugs and post-obstructive syndrome. You have a normal bicarb, that means there is no alkalosis or acidosis depending on blood pressure. As I said, you see whether there is magnesium depletion or renal tubular acidosis. So this is the brief short gap approach to hypokalemia. If you look at textbooks of nephrology, it goes into 2 pages, but from an intensive care perspective, this is what suffices for us to troubleshoot somebody with hypokalemia. Once you have diagnosed hypokalemia, you need to know how to correct it. Not every patient with hypokalemia deserves an IV correction because IV correction is dangerous, it's associated with complications. So, patients who had cardiac arrhythmias, if you are treating digoxin toxicity or you are looking at diarrheal stool loss of more than a liter an hour, or somebody has got neuromuscular symptoms or neuromuscular paralysis, are the candidates who deserve an IV correction. The rest all patients, if the gut is working, we use the gut for the correction. The schedule would be two types of correction. If somebody has life-threatening problems, you go for an aggressive correction where your target should be to keep it above 4. Between 3.5 to 4, you give 20 milliequivalents. All the way down to less than 3, you treat as an emergency with even 100 to 120 milliequivalents of potassium. But if you want to go with a more conservative, somebody doesn't have ventilatory support, not on vasopressors, non-coronary patient, you could go with a less aggressive correction as a normal way of correcting. But anything less than 3 in an ICU, you should treat it as an electrolyte emergency. Hyperkalemia, on the other hand, any serum potassium that exceeds 5 millimoles per liter qualifies for a description of hyperkalemia. And when the potassium crosses 6.5, you call it severe hyperkalemia. This is where arrhythmias tend to happen, although the absolute value of potassium does not correlate with the electrocardiographic changes. When you come to the causes of hyperkalemia, the most common cause in intensive care unit is a spurious hyperkalemia. You put a tourniquet on the arm while drawing the blood sample, or when you draw the blood sample and you inject it with the syringe under pressure, that itself causes lysis of the cells and produces high potassium. So spurious hyperkalemia is the most common cause of hyperkalemia in intensive care unit. Hemolysis and leukocytosis are also causes of hyperkalemia in the intensive care unit. The second most common are the drugs. Potassium sparing diuretics, cyclosporine, beta blockers and daptomycin. These are the drugs which are most commonly implicated in the genesis of hyperkalemia in the intensive care unit. Impaired excretion of potassium like in renal insufficiency and adrenal insufficiency or type 4 renal tubular acidosis, which is again linked to ACE inhibitors, are the other causes of hyperkalemia in the intensive care unit. Trauma patients, whether it is heat stroke, burns or rhabdomyolysis of non-trauma origin like a myxedema, coma or prolonged bed rest in a high BMI patient, these are all causes of rhabdo. So these are also causes of high potassium in intensive care unit. Absolute deficiency of insulin can cause hyperkalemia, and there is a pseudo hypoaldosteronism because of dehydration and drugs. These are all the causes of hyperkalemia in the patients. One of the classic descriptions or discussions that we often have is about the ECG and potassium. So the serum potassium of more than 5.5 is associated with repolarization abnormalities, and repolarization is represented by the T wave, so you get peak T waves on the ECG. If it is more than 6.5, you get atrial problems in the form of widening P wave, long PR interval and abolition of the P wave. That's when the junctional rhythms will take over. So you get a prolonged QRS interval with bizarre morphology, high degree blocks, atrial fibrillation or a sine wave pattern. If it is serum potassium more than 9, if you are good enough, the patient is lucky enough to record an ECG, you get all these patterns, but usually these are the two things that happen. I haven't seen, the maximum I have seen is 8.7. Somebody survived. More than this, usually it's RIP. Hyperkalemia, again you look at the ECG changes. If there are ECG changes, it's not necessarily that the ECG changes correlate with the potassium, but if you have tall T waves, look at potassium. That put the patient in the at least the high dependency unit, monitor his ECG, give the calcium to stabilize the myocardium, run the dextrose insulin, give beta agonists and diuretics, try to bind potassium in the gut by giving a combination of sodium polystyrene sulfonate with sorbitol. Still, if the ECG changes persist, we need to remove it by extracorporeal purification. If there are no ECG changes and the patient is already on hemodialysis, start the dialysis immediately. If there are no ECG changes and the potassium is more than 6.5, you go there. If the patient does not have CKD and the potassium is less than 6.5 but more than 5.5, look at the diet if it is moderate hyperkalemia, but anything between 5.5 and 6.5, give a potassium binding resin and modify the diet of the individual. So this is the brief algorithm for approach to somebody with hyperkalemia. Calcium homeostasis. The majority of calcium, close to 90% of calcium is present in the bones. This is again an electrolyte that is intrinsically linked to hormones, and the hormones which regulate calcium are parathormone, vitamin D and calcitonin. Calcium plays a crucial role in neuromuscular activity, coagulation, conducting system of the heart, vascular tone and exocrine and endocrine functions. When you measure calcium, just as when you measure anion gap, you don't declare the anion gap as normal unless you look at the albumin. You don't declare the calcium as normal unless you look at the corrected calcium for the albumin. So if somebody has a hypoalbuminemia, correct the calcium with this formula: 4 minus the albumin multiplied by 0.8 plus the measured serum calcium. That will be the total calcium of the individual. So always better to ask the lab to do an ionized calcium, because absolute calcium values do not reflect the effects of calcium in the cellular level. Again, like with phosphate and like with potassium, it has 3 main or 4 main determinants of absorption. 3 of them regulate its load, the 4th one regulates its absorption and elimination. So the gut, the bone and the kidney are two-way sources for absorption as well as secretion of calcium. So you could deposit calcium into the bone or resort the bone with the serum calcium, and therefore the parathormone levels are abnormal. So if you have granulomatous diseases like sarcoidosis or tuberculosis or some of those fungal infections, through a 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3 mediated mechanism of the small intestine, you get high extracellular fluid calcium. On the bone, on the other hand, if there has been an immobilization or a malignant tumor or high metabolic rate because of thyrotoxicosis, the calcium is mobilized and you get a high serum calcium that is resorbed from the bone. All these are regulated by the parathormone, but also from another hormone that is produced in the thyroid, that is calcitonin, right? It is produced by the parafollicular cells. Causes of hypocalcemia: hypoparathyroidism, which causes decreased entry into the circulation, and vitamin D deficiency. Increased loss from the circulation because of hyperphosphatemia, pancreatitis, or using some of these drugs like citrate or EDTA or meds in the bone. Sepsis and use of 5-fluorouracil can all cause hypocalcemia. If you notice, magnesium depletion is as important in the pathogenesis of hypocalcemia as it is in the pathogenesis of hypokalemia. So if you want to correct somebody's calcium and it's not budging, you probably would have to supplement magnesium as well. The clinical manifestations of hypocalcemia are essentially neuropsychiatric, where you can get seizures, altered sensorium, extrapyramidal symptoms, delirium, and of course these are not very often seen, but papilledema can be seen. There can be increased neuromuscular irritability like circumaural and axial paresthesias, myalgias and spasms, and the classical Schwarzschild and Trousseau sign, but these are not exclusive to hypocalcemia. Hypomagnesemia and hypophosphatemia can also cause the Schwarzschild and the Trousseau sign. Cardiovascular manifestations of hypocalcemia are a prolonged QT interval and can present with congestive cardiac failure. as well as with hypo. We had one patient whose ionized calcium was like 0.5 or 0.6, and we couldn't understand why her blood pressures were not fixed. Ultimately, somebody tried to check the ionized calcium, and we corrected the calcium, and we could reverse the blood pressure. You can also get autonomic symptoms like biliary colic, bronchospasm, and diaphoresis, but these are very non-specific manifestations of hypercalcemia. So when you have somebody whose ionized calcium or serum corrected calcium is low, we have to check the parathormone level. Based on that, the next step would proceed. If somebody's parathormone level is low, then you check the magnesium. If the magnesium is also low, you correct it. If the magnesium is normal, you are looking at hypoparathyroidism. Serum parathormone is high, you look at the creatinine and the blood urea. If they are normal, you look at the vitamin D levels and see whether they is normal or high. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, that is hypercalcemia. Hypercalcemia can happen because of metastasis, whether because of osteolytic mets or humoral because of paraneoplastic hormones or ectopic production of calcitriol. As I said, hypercalcemia of granulomatous disease can also produce high serum calcium levels, and the current fad about giving everybody vitamin D, right, just by checking the level itself can cause hypercalcemia. Thiazide diuretics, all hypertensives. Now the JNC 7 and 8 recommendations seem to suggest that thiazides are an integral part of hypertension management. So look at the drug list of the patient. If somebody is taking thiazides, watch their calcium. It's not as uncommon as we think it was before. Again, it produces neuropsychiatric manifestations. It can produce renal like polyuria, polydipsia, short QT interval, the classic description of abdominal groans and psychic moans, constipation and abdominal pain, and it can, contrary to popular belief, hypercalcemia itself can cause fractures because it does not allow phosphate to come into the bone and form the apatite. So hypercalcemia does not mean that somebody has got strong bones. It can result in pathophysiological fractures. So if you have somebody who is hypercalcemic, measure the immunoreactive parathormone. High hormone levels would trigger a check for calcium and creatinine. If the ratio is high, then it's a primary hyperparathyroidism. If it is low, it is familial hypercalcemic hyperparathyroidism. Based on these levels, you can triage patients into whether they have elevated parathormone related peptide, vitamin D levels or normal levels. So these are all the causes of hypercalcemia, but this is all long-term follow-up. We need to know whether it is actually causing some abnormalities in the electrocardiogram or not. Once you know it is causing some changes to the rhythm or the neuropsychiatric status of the individual, the first step is to aggressively hydrate the patient. If you think there is a scope for volume overload, use a loop diuretic, not a thiazide diuretic. So aggressive IV hydration followed by either biphosphonates or calcitonin. Calcitonin is very short acting, and people tend to develop tachyphylaxis to calcitonin. So the best is to use IV bisphosphonates, and in refractory cases we can use gallium nitrate. Dialysis does not eliminate calcium as effectively as it eliminates potassium. The regulation of magnesium homeostasis again depends upon the gut, the bone and the kidney, and significant contribution from the muscle. So these four entities have a continuous equilibrium flux that goes, so that you have a daily fecal output of about 260 milligrams and a urine output of 100 milligrams, and you take about 100 milligrams is what you retain every day from the diet you consume. So our daily requirement is about 100 milligrams of magnesium. Hypomagnesemia can be caused by some of the common drugs which we use in our practice, like aminoglycosides, amphotericin B, diuretics, insulin, and this proton pump inhibitors. Operative stress and trauma are very common causes of hypomagnesemia which we tend to overlook. Pancreatitis, malnutrition and diarrhea are gastrointestinal causes, and diuretic phase of ATM. Somebody is requiring for malaria, for example. He is in a diuretic phase. Watch the magnesium. Alcohol, blood transfusions and hungry bone syndromes, especially those patients who are being refed, are at risk of hypomagnesemia. Bariatric surgery. For example, somebody has undergone gastric banding surgery. He is in a relative fast. And you start enteral nutrition on this patient, they will have refeeding syndrome. And hypomagnesemia is one of the causes of refractory ventricular arrhythmias in a post-bariatric surgery patient. This shows phosphate homeostasis, another hormone-related electrolyte related to vitamin D. Again, between the gut, the kidney and the bones. Urinary phosphate excretion daily is about 600 milligrams, fecal excretion is about 300 milligrams. The skeleton has about 60 grams of phosphate, and this is the flux that happens every day. What are the causes and manifestations of hypophosphatemia? In critically ill patients, you need to remember that sepsis, trauma, refeeding and RRT are common causes of hypophosphatemia. And phosphate is an essential component of ATP, energy currency of the body. So if you have low levels of ATP, phosphate, the patient's cellular transport chain actually breaks down. Respiratory alkalosis and metabolic acidosis can cause hypophosphatemia. And catecholamines like norepinephrine, when we use for septic shock, can also worsen the hypophosphatemia. The manifestations include respiratory failure, because the respiratory muscles are the biggest consumers of energy in the body, minute to minute. That's why if you have hypophosphatemia, the muscles fatigue, and sometimes in severe hypophosphatemia, you can get rhabdomyolysis as well. Cardiovascular abnormalities like decreased myocardial contractility and arrhythmias can happen. Hemolysis can happen because of hypophosphatemia. And neuromuscular problems like rhabdo, as I said, seizures, encephalopathy, and central fountain myelinolysis can also happen because of hypophosphatemia, because that is essential for maintaining the integrity of the sphingomyelin lecithin related myelin sheath. So, if your serum phosphate is between 2 to 2.5, you don't need to give much of correction, but if it is between 1 to 1.5, you need to give about 0.24 to 0.3 millimoles per kg of IV phosphate, that is currently available as potassium dihydrogen phosphate. It contains about 20 milliequivalents of phosphate, but also has 60 milliequivalents of potassium. So you need to be very careful about using potassium dihydrogen phosphate. So I will end this talk by giving you 4 ECGs which we recorded over the last year or so in some of our patients, where the electrolyte abnormality has been diagnosed solely on the basis of this ECG. Standing at the bedside of the patient, looking at the monitor, we suspected that yes, this could be this. This is a sitter. This, I think all of us. So when you get the T wave elevation, this should be a sharp T wave. That it should be a peak T wave. If this tip is rounded, either it is ischemic myocardium or a pericarditis, it is not hyperkalemia. But if it is pointed like this, it is most often it is hyperkalemia. This is a patient with potassium of 8.7, sine wave pattern of ECG in a patient with severe hyperkalemia. Sorry? No, this patient had an abnormally short QT interval, hypercalcemia. This patient actually, we diagnosed multiple endocrine neoplasia after identifying hypercalcemia on this ECG. This torsades, right? Magnesium deficiency, more common in alcoholic patients, also common in those who get parenteral nutrition. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.